The studio lights were bright. The audience was smiling. The cameras were rolling live. No one expected the moment that was about to happen. Jonathan Roumie sat calmly at the table on The View, hands folded, listening carefully as the conversation shifted from entertainment to faith, beliefs, and personal values. He wasn't interrupting. He wasn't raising his voice. He wasn't arguing. Then Joy Behar leaned forward. Her tone changed. And with one sentence, everything in the studio froze. "Well, Jonathan," she said, "a lot of people would call that bigotry." The word hit the room like a slap. For a split second, no one moved. The audience gasped softly. The co-hosts exchanged uneasy looks. Even the cameras hesitated, zooming in on Jonathan's face. Millions of viewers were watching live. Jonathan didn't shout. He didn't react emotionally. He didn't fire back with anger. Instead, he went completely still. You could see it in his eyes. Not rage, not fear, but disappointment. This wasn't supposed to be an attack. This was supposed to be a conversation. The silence stretched longer than it should have. Long enough to make producers nervous. Long enough for viewers at home to lean closer to their screens. Jonathan slowly inhaled. In that moment, everyone expected him to defend himself. To debate. To argue. To explain. But what he did next shocked everyone. Without saying a word, Jonathan reached up and gently unclipped the microphone from his jacket. The audience froze. One of the hosts whispered, "Wait." Jonathan placed the mic carefully on the table, not slammed, not thrown, but set down with intention. Then he looked up. "I believe in love," he said quietly. "But I won't accept being labeled for having faith." The room went dead silent. No applause. No music. No interruptions. Just tension. Then Jonathan Roumie stood up from his chair. Joy Behar's expression changed instantly. The other hosts tried to speak. Producers waved frantically behind the cameras. But it was too late. Jonathan turned and began walking off the set. Live television. No script. No warning. A moment that would explode across the internet within minutes. And as the cameras struggled to cut away, one question echoed in every viewer's mind. Was this a powerful stand for dignity, or the beginning of a media firestorm no one saw coming? The morning had started like any other episode of The View. Bright lights warmed the studio. The audience buzzed with excitement. Producers moved with quiet urgency behind the cameras, counting down the seconds until the show went live. Jonathan Roumie sat at the long table, smiling politely as he adjusted his jacket. He wasn't there to provoke controversy. He wasn't there to argue politics or spark outrage. He was there to talk about his work, his journey, and the role that had changed his life forever. 4 years, Jonathan had carried a unique position in modern entertainment. Known worldwide for portraying Jesus in The Chosen, he had become a symbol of faith, humility, and compassion for millions. To some, he was inspiring. To others, he was controversial simply for openly speaking about belief in a world increasingly uncomfortable with it. But Jonathan understood that. He had walked into interviews before knowing full well that not everyone agreed with him, and that was okay. Disagreement didn't scare him. Disrespect did. As the cameras went live, the hosts welcomed him warmly. Smiles. Light laughter. Friendly applause from the audience. Everything felt smooth, almost rehearsed. They talked about acting first. Jonathan spoke about the responsibility of playing such an important figure. "How do you prepare for a role like that?" one host asked. "With humility," Jonathan answered. "You remember it's not about you." The audience nodded. Some applauded. Then the conversation shifted, subtly at first. It always did. One host asked about faith in modern culture. Another asked whether religion still had a place in entertainment. Jonathan answered calmly, choosing his words carefully. "Faith," he said, "is personal. It's not about forcing beliefs on anyone. It's about how you treat people." Still, the mood in the room began to change. Joy Behar leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, listening intently. She had heard these answers before, from guests who spoke about belief, values, and tradition. And she knew exactly where she wanted the conversation to go. So, Jonathan, she said, tilting her head slightly, some people feel that certain beliefs hurt others, especially when they clash with modern values. Jonathan nodded. I understand that concern, he replied. But having convictions doesn't mean lacking compassion. A brief pause. The audience shifted in their seats. The co-hosts glanced at one another, sensing the tension rising just beneath the surface. Joy leaned forward. But when those beliefs lead to judging others, she said, don't you think that becomes dangerous? Jonathan stayed calm. I don't believe in judging people, he said. I believe in loving them, even when we disagree. The words were measured, respectful, careful. Yet something about them didn't sit right with Joy. She sighed, shaking her head slightly. That sounds nice, she replied, but to a lot of people, it doesn't feel that way. Jonathan's smile faded just a little. This wasn't new to him. He had answered questions like this before, on podcasts, panels, and interviews. But something about this moment felt different. Sharper. Less curious. More accusatory. The air in the studio grew heavy. Cameras zoomed closer. Producers whispered urgently into headsets. The audience sensed it too, that uncomfortable feeling when a conversation stops being a discussion and starts becoming a confrontation. Jonathan shifted slightly in his chair. I think, he said carefully, we've reached a point where disagreement is automatically labeled as hate. And that's dangerous for dialogue. A few audience members applauded. Others stayed silent. Joy's expression hardened. So are you saying people are wrong for feeling hurt? She asked. No, Jonathan answered softly. I'm saying we should listen to each other without attacking character. Another pause. The silence stretched. This was no longer about a TV show. It wasn't about acting. It wasn't even about religion. It was about identity, labels, and how quickly respect could disappear when opinions didn't align. Jonathan glanced briefly toward the audience. Some faces showed support. Others showed skepticism. All of them were watching closely. What none of them knew was that this conversation, this seemingly ordinary exchange, was seconds away from crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. A single word. A single accusation. And a decision Jonathan Roumie would make that no one, not the hosts, not the producers, not the viewers at home, would ever forget. And when that word was spoken, the show would never feel the same again. The tension in the studio was no longer subtle. It sat heavy in the air, pressing down on everyone, the hosts, the audience, the crew behind the cameras. What had started as a polite discussion had quietly transformed into something sharper, something far more dangerous. Joy Behar leaned forward again. Her voice was calm, but the edge was unmistakable. Jonathan, she said, when people use faith to justify certain positions, it doesn't come across as loving. It comes across as exclusionary. Jonathan listened carefully. He didn't interrupt. He didn't roll his eyes. He waited until she finished. I don't use faith to exclude anyone, he replied. I use it to guide how I treat people, with respect. Joy shook her head slowly. But when your beliefs say something is wrong, she said, how is that not judging others? The audience murmured. Some nodded. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Jonathan paused before answering. There's a difference between moral conviction and personal condemnation, he said. I can believe something without dehumanizing someone. Joy's lips tightened. But that distinction, she said sharply, isn't always felt by the people on the receiving end. Jonathan inhaled deeply. I hear that, he said. But labeling people instead of listening to them only deepens the divide. That was when Joy crossed her arms. And that's exactly the problem, she replied. When people hide behind polite language, it allows harmful ideas to survive. Jonathan's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in concern. I'm not hiding, he said quietly. I'm speaking honestly. Joy leaned closer to the table. Well, honesty doesn't excuse impact, she said. And for many, those views sound like bigotry. The word hung in the air. Bigotry. The audience gasped audibly this time. One co-host instinctively reached for her notes. Another shifted in her chair, eyes wide. Jonathan froze. Not because he was shocked, but because he understood exactly what that word meant. It wasn't disagreement. It wasn't criticism. It was a character judgment. A label. Jonathan looked directly at Joy. "I reject that," he said firmly. "Disagreeing with ideas does not make someone a bigot." Joy raised her eyebrows. "But people who are hurt by those ideas don't see it that way," she replied. Jonathan leaned forward slightly. "And that's why conversations matter," he said. "Calling someone a name shuts conversation down." The studio felt like it was holding its breath. Producers whispered urgently into headsets. A cameraman adjusted his focus, sensing history unfolding in real time. The audience sat frozen, unsure whether to clap or stay silent. Joy didn't back down. "So what would you call it," she asked, "when beliefs contribute to discrimination?" Jonathan's jaw tightened. "I would call it a failure of empathy on all sides," he answered. "But I would never call a person a bigot for holding faith-based convictions." Joy's tone sharpened. "Some people would." And that was the moment something changed. Jonathan leaned back in his chair. The calm expression he had maintained all morning shifted, not into anger, but into clarity. "I came here expecting disagreement," he said slowly. "I did not come here to be personally labeled." Joy shrugged slightly. "Well, that's how it's perceived," she said. Jonathan nodded once. "I understand perception," he replied. "But perception doesn't define truth." The audience reacted. Scattered applause mixed with uneasy silence. Jonathan continued. "When dialogue turns into accusation," he said, "respect disappears. And without respect, conversation becomes pointless." Joy opened her mouth to respond, but Jonathan raised his hand gently. "Let me finish," he said. The room went quiet. "I've spent my career trying to portray compassion," he continued. "I believe in loving every human being, regardless of differences. But I will not sit quietly while my character is questioned." Joy stared back at him. "So what are you saying?" she asked. Jonathan paused. The cameras zoomed in. The tension was unbearable. Even the audience seemed afraid to breathe. "I'm saying," Jonathan said, "that disagreement is not hatred. And faith is not a weapon." A long silence followed. Joy glanced at the other hosts. One of them attempted a nervous laugh. Another shuffled her papers. But the damage had already been done. That single word, bigot, had crossed a line. Jonathan looked down at the microphone clipped to his jacket. For the first time since the interview began, he didn't look like a guest. He looked like a man making a decision. And in that moment, everyone in the studio felt it. Something irreversible was about to happen. For a moment, no one spoke. Not Joy. Not the other hosts. Not the audience. The studio, usually filled with constant chatter, applause cues, and overlapping voices, fell into a silence so thick it felt unnatural. The kind of silence that only happens when everyone realizes something has gone wrong, but no one knows how to fix it. Jonathan Roumie sat perfectly still. His hands rested calmly on the table, but his gaze had dropped slightly, no longer engaging in debate. It wasn't defeat. It was resolve. The kind that forms when someone reaches a line they will not cross. Joy shifted in her chair, clearly sensing the shift. "Well," she said lightly, attempting to soften the moment, "this is obviously a passionate topic." Her words floated awkwardly in the air. No one laughed. The audience didn't clap. The co-hosts didn't jump in. The cameras stayed locked on Jonathan's face. He slowly lifted his eyes and looked around the table, not accusingly, not angrily, but as if taking one last look at a place he no longer belonged. "This doesn't feel like a conversation anymore," Jonathan said quietly. The sound engineer glanced nervously toward the producer. A floor manager raised a hand slightly, unsure whether to cue applause or signal a commercial break. Jonathan continued. "I'm happy to discuss ideas," he said. "I'm even happy to be challenged. But being labeled crosses into something else." Joy exhaled sharply. "No one is attacking you personally," she replied. "We're talking about the impact of beliefs." Jonathan nodded once. "And I'm telling you how that label impacts me," he said. The audience stirred. A woman in the front row folded her arms. A man a few rows back nodded slowly in agreement. Phones began to rise discreetly, their screens glowing as people sensed this was no longer just daytime television, it was a moment. One of the co-hosts tried to intervene. "Maybe we should all take a breath," she said, forcing a smile. "These conversations are complicated." Jonathan looked at her appreciatively. "They are," he agreed. "Which is why they require care." He reached up instinctively, then stopped. For a second, his hand hovered near the microphone clipped to his jacket. The audience noticed. Joy noticed. The producers noticed. Jonathan hesitated, as if weighing something heavy and personal. Walking away from a live broadcast wasn't dramatic, it was serious. It meant headlines. It meant backlash. It meant being misunderstood. But staying meant accepting something he couldn't. "I want to be very clear," Jonathan said slowly, his voice steady but firm. "I respect every person at this table. I respect this audience. But I also respect myself." Joy's expression tightened. "So what are you saying?" she asked again, a hint of impatience creeping into her voice. Jonathan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he finally reached up and unclipped the microphone. The small metallic click echoed louder than it should have. Gasps rippled through the audience. One co-host whispered, "Oh my God!" Jonathan placed the microphone gently on the table, aligning it carefully, a deliberate act that felt symbolic, not impulsive. "I'm saying," Jonathan replied, "that I won't continue a discussion where my character is reduced to a label." The studio froze. Behind the cameras, a producer mouthed, "Cut to commercial," but the director hesitated. This was live. This was real. Cutting away too soon would only make it worse. Joy leaned back, clearly caught off guard. "Well," she said, trying to regain control, "that's your choice." Jonathan stood up. Not abruptly. Not angrily. But decisively. The audience reacted instantly. Some clapped softly, others sat in stunned silence, unsure whether applause was appropriate. A few voices whispered, "Is he really leaving?" Jonathan adjusted his jacket and looked one last time toward the table. "I came here for dialogue," he said. "I leave with my dignity." No music played. No farewell words followed. No one stopped him. As Jonathan turned and walked toward the edge of the set, the camera followed, just for a second too long, capturing a moment television wasn't prepared for. A guest choosing silence over spectacle. Respect over retaliation. And as the director finally cut to commercial, one truth was undeniable. This was no longer just an interview. It was a statement. The moment Jonathan Roumie stepped away from the table, the studio lost control. What usually followed a guest's closing remarks, applause cues, music, smooth transitions, simply didn't happen. There was no script for this. No plan. No backup. This was live television unraveling in real time. Jonathan took one step. Then another. The soft sound of his shoes against the studio floor echoed louder than any argument that had come before it. The camera followed him instinctively, as if even the lens understood that this was the moment viewers would remember. Behind the scenes, chaos erupted. A producer waved frantically, whispering into a headset. "Cut. Cut now." Another voice responded, "We're still live." Joy Behar sat frozen for a second too long, her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and irritation. One of the co-hosts leaned toward her, whispering urgently, but the microphones picked up fragments of it anyway. "Is he really leaving? What do we do?" Jonathan didn't look back. That detail mattered. He wasn't storming off. He wasn't slamming doors. He wasn't performing outrage. He was walking away, calmly, deliberately, as if he had already accepted the consequences. The audience didn't know how to react. A few people clapped quietly. Others stared wide-eyed. Some looked down at their phones, already typing messages they knew would go viral within minutes. Jonathan reached the edge of the set. For a brief moment, the stage manager stepped forward instinctively, as if to stop him, then hesitated. There was nothing to say that wouldn't make it worse. Jonathan paused. Just for a second. Not for the hosts. Not for the cameras. But for the audience. "I wish everyone well," he said softly. "Even when we disagree." Then he stepped off stage. The camera lingered on the empty chair he left behind. That chair, once just another seat at the table, now felt like a symbol of absence, of boundaries, of a line drawn quietly, without shouting. Joy cleared her throat. "Well," she said, forcing a laugh that didn't land, "that was unexpected." No one responded. One co-host tried to salvage the moment. "These conversations are important," she said carefully, eyes darting toward the producer's booth. "And emotions can run high." But the rhythm was gone. The audience could feel it. Viewers at home could feel it. Something authentic had happened, and authenticity doesn't fit neatly into daytime television. Finally, the director cut to commercial. The screen faded out. But behind the scenes, the storm had just begun. Producers rushed onto the set, voices overlapping. "Why didn't we stop it sooner? He just walked off live TV. This is going to blow up." Joy stood, visibly frustrated now. "He could have stayed and talked," she said. "Walking off looks dramatic." A producer replied under their breath, "So does calling someone a bigot on air." Silence followed. Meanwhile, Jonathan walked down the hallway away from the studio lights. The noise faded behind him, the murmurs, the arguments, the panic. He didn't pull out his phone. He didn't smile. He didn't look shaken. If anything, he looked relieved. One staff member passed him quietly and said, "I'm sorry." Jonathan nodded in return. "Thank you." Outside the studio, the world was already reacting. Clips were spreading. Hashtags were foaming. Opinions were colliding. Some viewers praised him for standing firm. Others criticized him for leaving instead of debating. Media outlets rushed to frame the moment, each in their own way. But none of them were inside that studio when the silence fell. None of them felt the weight of that word. None of them sat in that chair. Back on set, Joy adjusted her papers, trying to reset the tone. "Let's move on," she said. But everyone knew they couldn't. Because something had shifted, not just in the episode, but in the conversation around it. Jonathan Roumie hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't insulted anyone. He hadn't demanded an apology. He had simply stood up. And sometimes, that speaks louder than anything else. By the time the episode ended, the world outside the studio was already on fire. Clips of Jonathan Roumie standing up and walking off the view were spreading faster than producers could react. Short videos flooded social media, some with dramatic captions, others slowed down for emphasis, replaying the moment he unclipped his microphone again and again. Within minutes, hashtags began trending. Some praised him. Some criticized him. Everyone had an opinion. Finally, someone with dignity. He should have stayed and debated. Walking off was powerful. Walking off was weak. The internet did what it always does. It took a complex moment and split it into sides. Back inside the studio, the atmosphere was tense long after the cameras stopped rolling. Producers huddled in corners, voices hushed but urgent. Lawyers were looped in. Publicists drafted statements that said everything and nothing at the same time. Joy Behar sat quietly for a moment after the show wrapped, flipping through her notes without really reading them. One of the co-hosts approached her carefully. "That escalated quickly," she said. Joy sighed. "I didn't expect him to leave." Another host replied softly, "I don't think he expected to be labeled." No one argued. In the control room, the director replayed the footage. Not to analyze ratings or camera angles, but to understand the moment where control slipped away. There was no shouting. No chaos. Just a guest choosing to exit instead of endure. That made it harder to dismiss. Meanwhile, Jonathan Roumie returned home quietly. There was no press conference. No immediate statement. No victory lap. He sat alone for a moment, the noise of the day finally catching up to him. His phone buzzed non-stop. Messages from friends, fellow actors, people he hadn't heard from in years. Some simply said, "I saw it." Others said, "I'm proud of you." A few warned him, "This will get ugly." Jonathan read them, then set the phone down. He knew that moment would follow him. He accepted that. What surprised him wasn't the criticism. It was the number of people who said they felt seen. Messages poured in from viewers who said they had felt labeled before. Misunderstood. Reduced to a single word instead of heard as a human being. "I don't agree with everything you believe," one message read, "but I respect how you handled it." That mattered more than applause. News outlets began picking up the story, each framing it differently. Some headlines called it a meltdown. Others called it a bold stand. A few asked the question everyone was now debating. Is walking away a failure of dialogue, or a refusal to be disrespected? Talk shows discussed it. Podcasts dissected it. Clips were analyzed frame by frame. But one detail kept resurfacing. Jonathan never insulted anyone. He never raised his voice. He never demanded an apology. He simply left. That restraint confused people. Back at The View, producers met to discuss damage control. Should they invite Jonathan back? Should they issue clarification? Should they double down? Opinions were divided. One staff member said, "He didn't attack us." Another replied, "But now we look like we pushed him out." Joy addressed the moment briefly the next day, carefully. "We welcome passionate conversations," she said on air. "Not everyone agrees, and that's okay." She didn't repeat the label. She didn't apologize either. The silence between those choices spoke volumes. Meanwhile, Jonathan finally released a short statement. No anger. No accusations. Just clarity. "I believe in dialogue rooted in respect," it read. "When that respect disappears, stepping away can be an act of peace, not avoidance." The response was immediate. Supporters shared it widely. Critics challenged it. But no one could claim he escalated the situation. Days later, the moment was still being discussed. Not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. Jonathan Roumie had walked off live television without turning it into a spectacle. And in a world addicted to outrage, that restraint became the most controversial part of all. Because it forced people to ask an uncomfortable question. When is standing your ground louder than standing your ground with words? Long after the clips stopped trending, one thing remained. The silence. Not the awkward silence of a TV studio. Not the uncomfortable silence after an argument. But the deeper kind, the kind that forces reflection. Jonathan Roumie's walk-off wasn't remembered because of shouting. It wasn't remembered because of insults. It wasn't remembered because of drama. It was remembered because of restraint. In a world where outrage is rewarded and volume is mistaken for strength, he chose something different. He chose to leave rather than become what the moment demanded, angry, defensive, reactive. And that choice unsettled people. Some said he should have stayed and fought. Others said he showed courage by walking away. Many didn't know what to think, because moments like that don't fit neatly into headlines. But that's exactly why they matter. Respect isn't proven when everyone agrees with you. It's tested when they don't. Real dialogue doesn't collapse because of disagreement. It collapses when people stop seeing each other as human. That single word, the label, did more damage than any argument could have. Not because it was loud, but because it was final. It closed the door to understanding and replaced conversation with judgment. And Jonathan recognized that instantly. Walking away wasn't surrender. It was a boundary. Boundaries aren't walls meant to divide. They're lines meant to protect dignity. Too often, people are told that staying silent is weakness. That walking away means you lost. That if you don't respond, you let the other side win. But sometimes, the strongest response is refusing to play a game designed to strip you of respect. Jonathan didn't demand the last word. He didn't try to win the audience. He didn't chase validation. He chose self-respect over spectacle. And that choice sparked a larger conversation, one that went far beyond a single TV show. People began asking themselves hard questions. When do I speak? When do I listen? And when do I walk away? Because not every battle is worth fighting. And not every conversation is safe. There's a difference between being challenged and being diminished. Between debate and dismissal. Between dialogue and labeling. And knowing that difference is emotional intelligence. Jonathan Roumie's moment resonated not because of who he is, but because of what he represented in that moment. Someone who said, "I will not trade my dignity for airtime. I will not accept a label instead of understanding. I will not shout just to be heard." That message reached people who had been in similar situations, at work, with family, on social media, in public spaces. People who had been talked over, mocked, reduced to a single word. And it reminded them of something important. You don't owe anyone access to you, especially when respect disappears. Walking away doesn't mean you're afraid. It means you're aware. Aware that peace matters. Aware that self-respect isn't negotiable. Aware that silence can sometimes speak louder than any argument ever could. This story wasn't about religion. It wasn't about politics. It wasn't even about television. It was about how we treat people when we disagree. Because the real test of character isn't how loudly you defend your beliefs. It's how calmly you protect your humanity. So the next time you're faced with a moment like that, when words turn into labels, when dialogue turns into dismissal, when staying means shrinking yourself, remember this. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is stand up, unclip, and walk away.